Before we talk about more similarities between North Africa and the rest of Africa, it is important to state the differences between North Africa and Egypt, especially in the height of Egypt. When you look at Egypt, gold is not only just a big commodity, but it's the thing that resembles Egypt. Not only is it in their religion, in their economy, and in their art style, it is literally the one thing that you can say about Egypt that is central to its being. Gold seems to be the one thing that they value beyond anything else. And in this, you see a similarity between Nubia, which was called Nuba because the word Nuba means gold, and Egypt. And so you see an ancient, not just a small, an ancient connection between Nubia and Egypt. And it's not a small one. This is a direct connection, meaning that these two places were essentially belonging to a similar or the same bubble, and Egypt sought to control the Nubian gold many times over. And as such, the Nubians as well found it important to control the gold in Egypt. And they did at various times, just depending on which king you pick. Now, when I say Nubia, I mean the general Sudanese area. I do not mean the exact Nubian kingdoms. I don't mean the Kushites. I mean just in general. In contrast, North Africa is void of any real Egyptian influence. In fact, it is so void that almost nothing about Egypt is the same in North Africa. Until the Romans come, there are no tall buildings. They really, you can barely find any example of rock architecture. You can almost find nothing similar except maybe clothes. You find some sophisticated clothing a little bit, and you find um farming, which they suggest comes from the Middle East and moved into Africa. But again, there's a bit of a there because the farming is not identical to that of Egypt, and also it doesn't seem to be as ubiquitous as it is in the Middle East, whereas they're still hunter gatherers when the Romans came in those areas. And given how quickly farming spreads to throughout the entire nations of Africa, it's very puzzling that it wouldn't have spread that deeply. Of course, I showed that there's horses and there's other stuff like that. So there was some sophistication. But again, you find tents, you find mud structures, but you do not find buildings. And this is surprising given that the people who are in Egypt, who created Egypt, are claimed to be the same people who traveled into North Africa. Another thing to note is the lack of literature in the North African areas that exclude Egypt, while in Sudan and Egypt, the ancient Egyptian languages were written down, and we find pretty old literature from Sudan, which is based on Egyptian writing, which shows that there was a direct relationship between Egypt and Sudan. So the black people of Sudan and the Egyptians have a direct communication, a direct, hey, you here, I'm here, and they talk to each other. If we read Wikipedia, and I know some people don't trust Wikipedia, so put an asterisk on that, but let's read Wikipedia. It says the pre modern relationships between Egypt and Sudan. Contact between Egypt and Sudan goes back to ancient times when ancient trade routes have roots to 4000 BC. The ancient kingdom of Kush in modern Sudan and ancient Egypt engaged in trade, warfare, and cultural exchange. During the New Kingdom of Egypt, Egypt conquered further south into Kushite lands. Later, the Kushites would conquer Egypt, founding the 25th dynasty of Egypt. Afterwards, Egypt would fall to the Persians, Greeks, and later Romans. During this time, Christianity spread to Egypt and Sudan. Egypt was conquered by the Rashidun Caliphate in 652 AD, but the caliphate failed to spread into Sudan. A peace treaty was signed between Muslim Egypt and Christian Sudan called the Bakht, lasting centuries. After the Ottoman conquered Egypt, Sudan gradually converted to Islam. So as you can see, Egypt and Sudan have a basically they have a ancient relationship. Now, I do not want to give the impression that Egypt and other North African places did not have any relationship whatsoever, as we see that as far as Crete, like Crete is in um, offshore of North Africa and offshore of Europe, we see Egyptian relations going that far. So there would have been some trade with North Africa and some trade with Libya and Crete and Ethiopia and even further south than Ethiopia. We know this is a fact. But there's a difference between trade relations and direct relations, which is what is happening here. Sudan and Egypt are fighting on possibly equal terms because Egypt doesn't just take over and then the Sudanese bow down and then they fight back. There's a back and forth. There's a trade. There's a mutual understanding. There's population displacement. There's population movement, population assimilation in both nations. This is very different than what happened in especially the furthest parts of North Africa. Maybe the closest parts like Libya, there would have been a joining, but again, evidence. Given how close Egypt is to Libya and Chad and Sudan and Ethiopia, we can conclude that there definitely were interactions. In fact, the ancient Egyptians wrote about them. They wrote about the Libyans and how they invaded in the 23rd dynasty. And of course, there were other times that the Libyans were a problem. And so fortresses were built in that area to guard the border of Egypt. And so we do know that the Libyans had some interactions that are more direct with the Egyptians. The problem is when we go further into North Africa, the places where they claim are related to Egypt in the same way that Libya, Sudan, Chad, Ethiopia, and all these other places would be. I will go into detail about these Libyan kings at another point, but what's interesting is to look at Arput, who is the second. There's Arput the first, and he is Arput the second, and his grandfather is of Libyan ancestry, as it says in the writings of the Egyptians. And Arput clearly has a feature of sub-Saharan Africans, and one of the things you have to take from this is either Libyans or sub Saharan Africans, or he gained this through interactions with Egyptians, which would make Egyptians sub Saharan Africans. Either way, it's interesting. Interestingly, Aput and Tefnut, a Egyptian ruler, and Aput was a local Egyptian ruler, fought against the Kushites, and they fought to push back the Kushites in the time of Pir or Pi or Per, whatever you want to call him. He is a Kushite king who was trying to invade parts of Egypt. And Pir actually defeated both of them, but kept Aput as a regional king. Tunisia is very far away from Egypt, and so let's see. Stone Age tools dating from the Middle Stone Age found near Keleba are the earliest evidence of human activity in the region. Finds have been made of stone, blades, tools, and small fragments, figurines of Caspian culture, which lasted from 10,000 to 6,000 BC. So you see a consistent culture from 10,000 to 6,000 BC. Seasonal migration routes evidence their ancient journeys, Saharan rock art consisting of inscriptions and paintings that show design patterns as well as figures of animals and humans are attributed to the Berbers and also to native Africans from the south. Dating these outdoor art works has proven difficult and unsatisfactory. Egyptian influence is thought very unlikely. Among the animals depicted, alone or in stage scenes, are large horned buffalo, the extant Bubalus anticus, elephants, donkeys, colts, rams, herds of cattle, a lion, a lioness with three cubs. Human hunters may wear animal masks and carry their weapons. Herders are shown with elaborate head ornaments. A few other human figures are shown dancing, while others are driving chariots or riding camels. By 5,000 years ago, a Neolithic culture was evolving among the sedentary Proto-Berbers and Maghreb in northwest Africa, characterized by the practice of agriculture and animal domestication, as well as making of pottery and finely chipped stone arrowheads. They planted wheat, barley, beans, and chickpeas in their fields and used ceramic bowls and basins, goblets, plates, and large cooking dishes daily. These were stored by hanging on the walls of their domiciles. Archaeological evidence shows that these proto-Berbers were already farmers which with a strong pastoral element in their economy and fairly elaborate cemeteries well over 1,000 years before the Phoenicians arrived to found Carthage. Individual wealth was measured among the nomadic herders of the south by the number of sheep, goats, cattle a man possessed. Finds of scraps of cloth woven in stripes of different colors indicate that these groups wove fabrics. Some people will take this as if I'm insulting the development of Tunisia, but actually, no, I'm showing you that Tunisia is related to West Africa, and everybody believes it now. Everybody pretty much is sure that North Africans had a similar influx of people from West Africa, especially from the areas which were higher in West Africa. This fact, by the way, is regardless of race, regardless of what the race of the people of the Berbers were, the connection with West Africans is obvious. And to me, this probably tells you why there's such a consistent lining of cultural clothes between West Africans and North Africans, but we'll talk about that in the next video.